En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Al proteger al jaguar, apoyamos a que los bosques se mantengan vivos, las especies subsistan y el agua siga corriendo por el continente. Él solo existe si el ecosistema está saludable. En Conexión Jaguar, protegemos, recuperamos y conectamos los hábitats naturales del jaguar en Latinoamérica a través del apoyo a proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques. Con los proyectos apoyados, mitigamos los efectos del cambio climático al preservar los bosques, que son grandes almacenadores de carbono. Innovamos para que la conservación en manos de las comunidades sea rentable y autosostenible. Al brindar apoyo técnico y económico, para que iniciativas forestales en Latinoamérica comercialicen créditos de carbono de alta calidad para financiar la conservación en el corredor del jaguar. Contribuimos a la protección y mejoramiento de los servicios que nos brinda la naturaleza, la protección de la biodiversidad, la mitigación del cambio climático. Además, apoyamos al empoderamiento y desarrollo de las comunidades rurales. Nos sumamos a las metas globales de sostenibilidad, apoyando al cumplimiento de convenios internacionales y ayudando a la reducción del impacto del cambio climático. Para cambiar el futuro del planeta, necesitamos pasar de los diagnósticos a las acciones. Haz parte de Conexión Jaguar. Apoya proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques o compensa tu huella de carbono con nosotros para que juntos dejemos un legado a las futuras generaciones. Si hay conexión, hay vida.
The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization that funds reporting that otherwise wouldn't get covered. We take the work in those projects, use it in our educational engagements to extend the life of the reporting and promote as much conversation as we can.
It is vital to tell underreported stories because we live in a world that's much bigger than us.
Hola a todos, voy a hacer una pequeña nota en español antes de comenzar. Este seminario será en inglés. Para acceder al servicio de traducción simultánea, quienes estén interesados deben seguir las instrucciones que aparecen en la descripción del video, sea en Facebook o en YouTube. Entonces, quiero invitarlos a leer esas instrucciones y activar la traducción. Bueno, dicho eso, comienzo en inglés. So, hello again to everyone. My name is Camilo Jimenez. I am a Colombian journalist. I'm very happy to welcome you, every one of you who has tuned in for this webinar with the title, Local Solutions to Global Challenges. I also want to say hi to our participants, Disha Shetty, Annika McGinnis, and Joshua Cogan. Thank you so much for accepting this invitation and for connecting to this conversation from very different parts of the world. This free webinar is the fourth and last one of a series organized by this fabulous partnership between Fundación Gabo, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and Grupo ISA and its program Conexión Jaguar. These sessions have featured 16 journalists from 11 countries, and it has had the purpose to present tools for strengthening high-quality reporting on issues such as biodiversity, wildlife conservation, corruption, environmental destruction, and perspectives of different local communities in the context of COVID-19. Environmental issues used to be centered in specific parts of the world, and that we sometimes even call hotspots. But they always transcend landscapes and political boundaries and make us wonder how, from the perspectives of journalism, covering and communicating local stories in the face of environmental change can also have global impacts. So this webinar today is meant to be an opportunity to listen to experiences of local, in-depth reporting in 3 different parts of the world, and to discuss about the relationship these experiences can have, should have, with global issues, with global journalistic approaches, and with global solutions. So this will be the topic during the next 75 minutes. This webinar has been organized in the following way, however. First, each of the 3 participants will have up to 10 minutes to present some very interesting work they've done with support of the Pulitzer Center. Then for about 20 minutes, I will have a conversation with them, with Disha, Annika, and Josh. And at the end, for another 20 minutes, we'll have the opportunity of answering the questions that you folks in the audience want to make, either on Facebook or on YouTube. So I really want to invite you to make your questions. It doesn't matter if you make them during our conversation or during the presentations. Our team will be gathering together, putting together those questions, and I'll try to consider every single doubt, comment, or question you have. So let's start then. Before I give the word to Disha, who would be the first of our participants presenting her work, I would like to tell you very briefly who she is. Disha holds a master's in science, environment, and medicine journalism from Columbia University in New York. She also has a diploma in TV journalism from the Asian College of Journalism in Chennai and a bachelor's in mass media from the Mumbai University. She's an independent science journalist based in India with nearly a decade of experience across television, digital, and print formats in reporting and in editing roles. She writes on public health, climate change, and the intersection between those 2 areas. Her work, Disha's work, has appeared in many media, among others Vice, India's Pen, and The Wire. She has held full-time positions at Times Group, Z Digital, DNA, and most recently she was the associate editor at India's Pen. That's India's first data journalism initiative. In 2018, Disha won the Global Health Reporting Contest Award, and last year she was RAF Fellow to the United Nations. She has received grants, among other organizations, from the Pulitzer Center. So Disha, welcome, and I give you the word.
Thank you so much, and it's very nice to be a part of this webinar. So I'm going to talk about a series that I did for India's Pen, of which one of the stories was funded by the Pulitzer Center. If I could have the presentation up, so I could talk through the presentation. Yeah. So about 2 years back, I was selected for a fellowship with India Spend, which is India's first data journalism initiative. And the theme of the fellowship was to talk about and to report on India's climate change hotspots. So the idea was for 6 months, a journalist would travel around India reporting on how climate change was affecting communities. Some of the things that we decided at the onset was that we wanted as much geographical diversity as possible. We wanted to talk about different communities. We wanted to talk about vulnerable groups and specifically women. The idea was to just combine what our reporting throws up and ground anecdotes say with what latest climate science is. And so when we got started, it was just me essentially doing the reporting. And for 6 months, I did an exciting reporting project for me. Next. So for this reporting project, eventually I ended up going to 7 different states in India. In each areas, I looked at a different aspect of climate change. For instance, on screen, you see 2 images. On top, the left-hand side, the image is from Sundarbans, which is the largest mangrove forest in the world. It's towards the eastern side of India. Half a section of Sundarbans falls in, major part of Sundarbans is actually in Bangladesh, and a section of it is in India. And then I also went to both eastern and western coastline of India. I went to a desert state in the country. I also wrote about forests, and that's the story that I'm going to talk about today. So next. So to write about forests, I went to the state called Meghalaya. Meghalaya is a state in India which has 80% of that state is covered with forests, which is 3 times India's average forest cover. So it's one of the states with the largest proportion of forest cover. And Meghalaya is, because it's a northeastern part of India, and there's a map in the next slide. If you could just go to the next slide. Right. So if you see Meghalaya there, it's wedged somewhere between Bhutan and Bangladesh. So it has Bhutan to its north and Bangladesh to its south. And to the east of Meghalaya, a little to the east, is Myanmar. So it's in a section of India that's also a news desert. It's it's geographically a little bit isolated. It's underreported on. And one of the reasons I wanted to report from Meghalaya is to talk about different parts of India and to make sure that my series has reporting from as many diverse landscapes in India as possible. And that's one of the reasons I chose to go to Meghalaya. Next slide. So Meghalaya receives one of the heaviest amount of rainfall in India. It has dense forests. Some of it is, a large section of it is actually rainforest. I decided to go to Meghalaya after looking at a science research paper by the Indian Institute of Sciences in Bangalore. And that paper was actually done in collaboration with the state government in Meghalaya. The report showed that because of climate change, the rainfall patterns had started to change in Meghalaya, and there was a change in temperature in that place. So essentially, the report was talking about the local climate change that was happening, and it formed the starting point for my reporting, because I already had evidence that suggested that there is climate change that's happening here. And this change that had happened over a period of 2 decades. So it wasn't something, it was concrete evidence of local changes in temperature and local changes in rainfall. And so I decided that I'm going to travel to this place and start talking to communities to see what the stories throw up. Next. So Meghalaya is unique in India because about 90% of its forest is actually not controlled by the government. It's controlled by indigenous communities. Now, that pattern of control itself is a little unique to India, because a large part of the forest is controlled by the government in the rest of the states. And there is a kind of tussle for control of these resources that is ongoing at the moment. And there is a Supreme Court case that is ongoing. But in Meghalaya, you see in action what local communities can do and what having forests in the control of local communities can do. So Meghalaya had this unique tradition of every village will protect a section of forest, and they consider forests as a spiritual area. That's where a lot of prayers happen, and there is a unique concept of how a community would protect the forest, and it would be considered as an inviolable space. And that was fascinating to me, and that was reported in certain parts in northeastern India, but I did not see much of that reporting in mainstream national publications in India, and that's one of the reasons I decided to write about it. The stories of local communities evolved from the ground reporting, because when I'd gone there, I had only seen the research paper, and that's one of the reasons I went there. But once I started talking to government officials there, they directed me to the local communities, and they said that, these people are doing the real work, and you must write about them and you must feature them. And that's when I went, spoke to them. I visited these protected forests that were under control of communities. Now, that's where the idea of solutions journalism also came from, because I had taken a session in the Office of Solutions Journalism Network a year prior to this reporting. And I had learned and I'd understood that this would be a good approach to do certain stories. And I was looking forward to a story where I could use this format. And by the time I reached Meghalaya, I had already done some of the reporting for my climate change series, and I'd started hearing back from people. And a lot of people sometimes would write to me on email or respond on Twitter, and they would ask things like, what can we do? And it was quite evident that a lot of people wanted to be actively involved, and there's a lot of scope for highlighting local issues that can give ideas to people in different parts of the country on how they can protect resources in their own communities. Now, one of the things that I was also careful about was to not necessarily say that this approach that the communities in Meghalaya take is the right approach, because I was also very factual, and there were elements of, despite this approach by the community, the forests were depleting. And so I was careful to also talk about the flaws, and I was also careful to talk about how some sections of the community was also involved in deforestation. And because they would not necessarily, every village wouldn't necessarily protect the forests around it. And so I was careful to do that kind of balancing act. But one of the things that I was very keen on doing was to talk about what is it that a local community can potentially do to save its resources. This is not the format that I just took for this story. There's another story that I did as a part of this series where I spoke about how local women's groups were highlighting issues that were related to climate change in their state, and that was in the state of Odisha. I also understood that this approach of talking about what community is doing might not be relevant to every single story. And it's not an approach that you can take in every single story, because there are stories where nothing is really happening and there aren't local solutions. At the same time, I saw it as very crucial to highlight solutions wherever there was, so that my reporting also gives a sense of hope to people who are reading, because I realized that people were really tired of hearing how climate change is affecting the world, and they really wanted to see that there are things that you can also do to mitigate these changes, or they wanted to see stories of hope. And I saw this as borderline activisty journalism, but also as factual reporting. So that balance was tricky to get. That's it from my end.
Also maybe for our public, because afterwards, I mean, the idea of these webinar is that you guys in the audience have the chance of understanding how in these three cases, these three journalists craft their narratives and how they approach their local topics. So I just took some notes. It's an underreported region, a region that's 90% controlled by indigenous communities. That's a very local phenomena, and I think it's a shared local phenomenon in other countries of the world. And this community and this region is under critical effects because of climate change since 20 years. And that's also, I mean, that's a local, that's a global phenomenon acting upon local and communities' lives. And in the third, as a third point, I just took a note about your approach, being it a solutions journalism approach, aiming to, on the one hand side, share ideas, make them known in a wider context, and moving in a very, let's say, shaky terrain between activism and journalism. But it's really interesting to hear that you're aware of that, and that that's still a way of doing things. So thank you very much, Tisha. We'll discuss about that later. Now I want to introduce Joshua Cogan. Josh is an Emmy Award-winning photographer and anthropologist who has traveled to more than 60 countries to do his work. His work develops across print, motion, and web platforms. His projects have been widely published and exhibited. He has a feature-length documentary, I think you were the cinematographer, Josh, correct me later if I'm wrong, of New Delhi's last magician's ghetto called Tomorrow We Disappear. And that documentary was premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival and Hot Docs. His new approaches of storytelling and cultural exchange have earned recognition from standard bearers of journalism, such as the National Academy of Television and Sciences, South by West, and the Webby Awards. Using his passion for culture, ecology, and imagery, Josh has specialized in telling stories of culture and transitions. Whether it be 10th generation totem carvers from Alaska or hip-hop pioneers in his hometown, DC, he looks to bring people closer to that which they see as the other through intimate and personal imagery. Josh, please tell us about your project, the project you want to share with us today, and welcome to this webinar. We can't hear you, Josh. Or
thanks for the reminder. Thank you, Camila. As I hear the bio, I'm just reminded that all of us, after a certain while, our bios should have read, we've been at this a while. I've been at this some time, which is in some ways how I ended up doing this project in Alaska. I was actually in Alaska, in southeastern Alaska, specifically in Ketchikan and the Prince of Wales Island, sometime in 2013 on a tourism-based project, actually just kind of supporting and doing some portraiture of local artisans and craftsmen and some of the historical industry of place. Let me just make sure you can hear me. Through that, I was asked to go to a logging site kind of serendipitously one morning, which required me taking a helicopter ride into the logging sites because there was no active roads there, and landed in a logging camp where I ended up spending the next 36 to 48 hours. And it was an old growth logging site, not something I actually realized was still happening in the United States at that time. And through my naivety, it ended up being a fairly powerful and emotionally impactful experience that I was in to be on this logging site. And so I would start us off a little bit by talking. I'm going to go into my slideshow here. So just so you can see the images themselves. And hold on one second. So to give you a sense of the Tongass Forest is 17.7 million acres. It's the largest temperate rainforest in the United States, still one of the largest preserved old growth temperate rainforests in the world. It banks 8% of the carbon of all of U.S. forests alone. So it has a really powerful, not only national significance, but also global significance in terms of carbon banking. The forest is largely spruce, cedar, and coniferous forest. It is an expansive and goes all the way up to the Bristol Bay area, and is a really powerful landscape. And when I arrived there for the first time, it was kind of walking into something that I'd only heard about in storybooks. As you can see, the forest is covered with moss. There's so much moisture trapped in this forest. It ends up having a very almost a dark dankness to it, which can really feel like a relief in the very hot Alaskan summers. And in the very cold Alaskan winters, not actually a lot of snow hits the forest floor because of the canopies that exist there. So it's a very old and integrated ecosystem. And when I first went there, I was paired up with some loggers, a portrait of which you see here. Old growth logging tends to be somewhat of a cottage industry at this point, only because not a lot of it is left. Most of the logging work that we understand in the world, particularly in some of the more developed nations, ends up being second growth logging, which is a lot less labor intensive. It's much more machine heavy. Old growth logging, because of the nature of the trees, the root structures, just the danger of the work alone, tends to be a fairly aged profession. So a lot of the people that you see doing it tend to be older men. And they have followed it up. It's a trade craft. They followed up from the Pacific Northwest into Alaska, where there still is some old growth logging. And what I'm showing you here is a picture of the first time I ever saw an old growth tree fall. You don't get quite the scale of the base all the way down, which is probably about 10 feet at its root structure. And we had driven up to see this pair of loggers cutting the tree, and they were machining, chainsawing it, and then it eventually fell. And the sound it is really hard to describe to anyone that hasn't been or seen an old growth tree log, but I have to compare it almost to another experience that maybe none of us have ever seen, or certainly none of us have ever seen, is it feels like a dinosaur falling like you would see in the movies or a Jurassic Park movie. The sheer intensity of sound, the shaking of the ground. And then after the tree is cut, you will see water just pouring out of the base, right? Because it's using massive amounts of capillary action to suck moisture all the way to the top of these 120, 150 foot crowns of the trees. It really feels like cutting a vein. And I was very shaken. And when the man that was taking me around, who was another old logger, who was the site manager, he looked at me and he said, "Josh, if you don't feel something when you see that, something's wrong with you," which was not something I actually had expected to hear.
Josh, we are not able to see your pictures right now.
Oh, you're not seeing?
Maybe, no. You can try again sharing your screen.
Let me try, one more time here. Hold on. Give me 1 second. Let me try this once more. And just let me know verbally, just because when I'm on the screen share, I can't see any of the products.
Okay, now we can see them.
You can see now. So let me back you up just so you can kind of see where I was coming from. I was giving you that very dramatic explanation of everything, but without seeing it, it's not fine. So here is the Tongass, kind of a view of the Tongass. Again, this is the forest floor, heavily covered in moss. These are some of the loggers that I was paired with the first time I went, and this is the visual of the first tree falling. You guys are still seeing the screen okay? Is that a yes? Just tell me audio wise. Yeah? Okay. So when you come to the clear-cut sites and you see sites like this, it's a very, first of all, not only labor-intensive job, but very dangerous job for the men involved. And this is where I start thinking about really the local orientation of these issues, right? So the land that I'm showing you, and part of the work that Pulitzer was able to support in doing this, is the land that this old growth is specifically happening on right now is on land owned by Native corporations. So in 1971, the U.S. federal government went into a Native Claims Settlement Act. It was called ANCSA, in which they resolved not only the monetary but land-based debts of colonization. And they organized the local tribes into Native corporations, which, as part of their charters, were required to return profit for their shareholders, but also created increasingly imperfect organizing units, because as opposed to being organized by tribe, as they are in the lower 48, which has also all of its own liabilities, of course, here they're almost organized regionally. So within the Alaska Native Corporation, which is the Native corporation that owns these timberlands that are being harvested, you have the Haida, the Connecticut, and the Tsimshian peoples, all of which are very unique tribes that also have some historical conflicts involved with them. There was a lot of warring and territorial skirmishes in those areas over the last 10,000 years of native inhabitation. And that certainly has persisted in terms of how resources are distributed and how lands are used for logging. So the other local orientation of this is that as part of these charters, they had to return profits to their shareholders. And as a function of that, the only really native industry to southeastern Alaska, because there's some fishing, but there is no oil, there is no mineral. The major resource and industry that existed was timber. That was there. So when the Alaska Native Corporation was given hundreds of thousands of acres, they had but little choice to log the land. There was a fair amount of resistance amongst the Native communities to actually be the loggers. So they bring in timber outfits that go ahead and do that. And those workers are generally coming up from the Pacific Northwest. And this is, again, where we kind of start fundamentally getting into American political issues about land use and conservation. When these loggers are told that they're not allowed to do what they make their living upon, also many of them lost their jobs, or their communities lost their jobs when Species Protections Acts went in place in Oregon and Washington State for species like the spotted owl. There was a lot of anger and resentment that was built towards kind of liberal or environmental or land conservation communities, which is something that's really worth noting. There's also a lot of blood in the soil in these industries. And what I say by that is a lot of these men have had family members hurt. They've been hurt themselves. Just last week, I learned that Mike Mansfield, one of the loggers I had spent time with from Forks, Washington, had been hit by a felled tree. He's now in traction. His back is broken. His father had been killed 40 years before by logging. He was out there, and the words he would say to me is, "Every time I'm out here, I feel closer to my dad." Right. And then to hear that he was hurt the same way is really sad. So it can be very easy, as somebody who comes from an environmental standpoint, or certainly focused on conservation and preservation of resources, to not demonize people that we see doing work to get by, or to understand the reasons with which they do it, or why they do it, or the symbology for them. This is Mike himself actually cutting a tree. You can see him felling it right there. And the work is very long and it's very hard. I share this picture because the men start work, especially in the summer, at around 4:30 in the morning and don't quit until about 4 or 5 in the afternoon. They live in, usually, at this point, there's very few logging camps left, but historically what has been done is they live in logging camps on site throughout the season, and they can be lonely jobs, right? You can really, You can kind of feel that a lot in this image. There's also a love for the forest. And if I am starting to run over, please feel free to just kind of speak up again. I can't see the shared screen just because I have this. And I show this picture because it's one of the loggers in the evening. You can see he's got a spruce tea tattooed in his arm with birds coming out of it, right? And so there's a way in which the logging provides healing for the local communities, both the communities that are funding the operations, because those dividends are returned to them to replace cultural education, healthcare, and community housing, but also for the loggers that are out there. They're out there in the woods for a reason. They love the woods. And this is one of the great ironies kind of built into this story. This is just at sunrise looking over the McKinsey Inlet, one of the areas that was logged. And you get some more of these. And so to make the turn here, the reason that this story was prescient is that these lands that are being logged, some of them were starting to be preserved. So in 2018, California opened up its cap and trade. It's basically its carbon banking system to be able to purchase carbon sequestration rights and land rights from private corporations outside of California, which provided the opportunity for See Alaska to be able to preserve some of its lands and also be paid. I think in this case, they were paid $80 million to leave some of the forests alone. And so you get two things here. You get preservation of old growth ecosystems and carbon banking. You also get proceeds going through the tribes in which they are finally given a different way in order to monetize the lands that they have. But it doesn't mean that logging has stopped. It means that it's stopped on some of the land, but it still continues in certain places. In many cases, some of the prime timber areas are still logged, while some of the less prime timber areas are left alone and put into the carbon banking program. One of the challenges visually of the story was trying to really make these trees stand out. Well, you get the kind of the fierce guttural reaction when you look at those clear cuts, also understanding that these are individual trees, individual beings, and that each loss is unique. And I share these stories at end. This is one of the Tsimshian elders, Gloria, leading the group in tribal dance ceremonies that happen there regularly. This is Nate Jackson, a 10th generation totem carver. Totem carving is part of the tradition, which is when we start talking the politics of logging to the people that are running the native corporations, they'll remind you that they have often felled trees for cultural use and that they know how to manage forests in their own ways. So this also becomes kind of a sticky point when we're talking about. And then primarily, fundamentally, on both the tribal level and an ecological level, this area that we're seeing behind us, this Hedda Lake area, was prime salmon fishing grounds and still is, thanks to the carbon banking program. But what was starting to happen as they logged closer and closer to these communities, and you can see on that far off ridge and behind that it has been logged, is salmon require clear streams and coverage in order to spawn and go up the streams at the end of each season. This is food that is very important to some of the smaller communities on Prince of Wales Island. And as you log them, the salmon fisheries go away for more than a couple of reasons, not just logging pressure, but also climate change, right? The waters have to be a certain temperature in order to encourage salmon for salmon to go up. Here you're looking at Tony Christensen and his nephew as they do a subsistence fish for sockeye. And they also use the forest for gathering, subsistence gathering, berry gathering, foraging, and all these things. Mm-hmm. This will just be the final slide I'll share with you here. So one of the lands that was preserved, and I'd heard about this the first time I'd gone up, as they were kind of walking through this forest every time when they do an old growth log, they kind of square off an area and they kind of look at the trees and the scape and where they're going to build the roads. And when they were doing this the first time, the same logger that had told me, if you don't feel something when you see this, something's wrong with you, said, I found an old canoe when I was mapping out this territory. And so when I had heard about this and I was going back up there, I was like, I would really love to see this canoe. I just always had this vision of this moss-covered canoe sitting in the forest. And they said, we'll show it to you. So this has also been a way, this carbon banking program and the Native Claims Act was a way for them to actually hold archaeological and sacred sites that are important to the tribes. This opens up a whole other valence. But just to kind of close you on a really powerful image, this is one of those canoes. This canoe is probably 500 years old. They don't know why it didn't end up going out to sea. It's about a half mile from sea, which was they would fell the trees, they would carve it, hollow it out, and then they would carry it out to sea. A number of things could have happened. It could have been that when they were doing the final, they will put hot boulders in the base in order to kind of burn out. It could have cracked. It also could have happened that smallpox came through these communities around that time, which happened with colonization, both from Russian and Norwegian communities that came to the area. So the canoe was never left. So this is a very kind of layered and complex story. And it certainly is very local and has very global and national implications in terms of climate change. And I think that gets it around. Let me stop sharing the screen and come back to you guys. And hopefully I touched on some of the highlights of the story.
Of course, Josh, that was pretty impressive. So thank you very much. And as you just underscored, I mean, we're again in a forest, as in Dish's case, with very local, very complex, specific, particularities. You have a logging site, you have no roads, you only as a journalist had 48 hours to be there and, get to try to understand this world. Pretty of it is and will remain unknown. There are people with their issues, with their sufferings. They have their specific stories. And all of that is usually and that's also something common with what Disha just told us some minutes ago, that's also underreported. And I would even say understood, not just misunderstood, but less than understood. We are not capable of understanding those very, very local issues. And then at the other side, you have industries and you have international timber supplying, and you have also this international discourse of environmentalism that is a basis for corporative thinking and acting in those regions. So that's something very interesting about what you just told us, Josh, and I think it has a lot in common with what Disha just presented before you. So I was just making those notes for public, also for them to make their questions and for us discussing later. But now I'd like to go to Africa. Annika, before you start your presentation, let me just introduce you as well to our audience. Annika McGinnis is a multimedia journalist and media development specialist from the United States. She graduated from the University of Maryland in 2016 with degrees in journalism, international development, and French. As a journalist, Annika has reported for Reuters in the White House and on Capitol Hill, for USA Today, and for the McClatchy newspapers. She also worked with the Advocacy Project, NGO, in Washington, D.C., with Internews, Earth Journalism Network, with Amnesty International, and with Soluciones Comunitarias, that's a Nicaraguan social enterprise. In 2016-2017, she was a Global Health Corps Fellow in Kampala, and she managed communications, public relations, and partnership development for Reach Out Mbuya Parish HIV/AIDS Initiative, a community-based HIV/AIDS NGO. With Africa Water Journalists, Annika is today the co-founder of Infonile.org, a geojournalism platform that visualizes and maps data on water issues in the Nile Basin with journalism stories. And today, she also works as the Director of Programs and Strategy with the Media Challenge Initiative, a media development nonprofit in Kampala, in Uganda, where I believe you're sitting right now, Annika. So thank you very much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Camilo, and thank you also to the Pulitzer Center for giving me this chance to share about our work. We're really grateful for that. I'm hoping that someone could share my presentation. Okay, thank you. So I'm the co-founder of InfoNile, and you can go to the next slide. And we are a collaborative cross-border group of geojournalists in the Nile Basin. And the Nile Basin runs through 11 countries in Africa, from Tanzania and Rwanda in the south, all the way up to Egypt in the north. And we have a mission to uncover critical stories on water issues and also environment through database multimedia storytelling. We are the flagship project of Water Journalists Africa, which is a network of water journalists in Africa, founded by Frederick Mujira, who is also the co-founder of InfoNile. He's a Ugandan journalist working with New Vision. You can go to the next slide. So our approach kind of combines local and international storytelling on environmental and scientific topics with a focus on water. So we usually first identify a theme of common and cross-border importance in the river basin. For instance, right now we're focusing on projects on water scarcity during COVID-19, climate change solutions, wildlife trafficking and conservation, biodiversity in transboundary lakes, and also looking at foreign land deals in the Nile Basin. After identifying a theme, we usually source for credible data that's cross-cutting across the countries. And some of the sources we've looked at include water access data, climate change data, specifically looking at rainfall and runoff data, and also land acquisition data. You can go to the next slide. So after identifying the data, we ask our journalists in our network to submit pitches to report in-depth stories based on the data in their country or in their community. And we provide funding so that they can go out and do really in-depth field reporting. We also provide mentorship and training for them in data journalism and science reporting. And we work with them to create visualizations that they publish on their media houses. So after they publish in their local media houses, we translate the stories to regional languages, including Arabic, Amharic, Swahili, and French, to publish on our site. And then we work to create cross-border multimedia projects. And these ones are more for an international audience, which combine elements from all of the local stories, as well as more data analysis. And this is where we also try to incorporate different geojournalism visualizations like interactive maps, drone video, photography, satellite imagery, and different kinds of graphics. And along with that, we also create actionable interactive maps that we publish alongside the stories on our site, which is kind of the geojournalism model. Go to the next slide. Based on surveys of some of the journalists in our network, the in-depth stories do have some good impacts, including government investigations and policy changes or other media covering the stories. Go to the next slide. So the story I wanted to talk about today is called Sucked Dry. It was a year-long project which brought together about 8 journalists from the Nile Basin, data wranglers from Code for Africa, which is our major partner in Africa, supporting on data mentorship and training and creation of visualizations. And it looked at large-scale foreign land deals in the Nile Basin countries. We published it on the New Vision in Uganda and Science Africa platform in Kenya. You can go to the next slide. So we started with data from the Land Matrix, and the Land Matrix is an independent global land monitoring initiative that compiles data on land grabs or land deals from different sources, including governments, companies, NGOs, media, and also citizen contributions. So we did some analysis and we found out that 16.9 million hectares of land from 445 individual deals had been concluded in the 11 Nile Basin countries. Most of these were actually in large-scale agriculture and others were in forestry and timber, renewable energy, and mining. And we found that the investor countries were coming from all over the world, from Western countries, from Asian countries, the Middle East, and the USA. You can go to the next slide. So we use this data to create an interactive map on our website. You can go to the next. And if you zoom in on the map, you can see aggregate data for each country, looking at the land deals and then the investor countries. And you can also zoom in and check out which land deals are in your area and get more information about them. Go to the next slide. So this is the example of a page that you would see if you click on one of the deals, and you can find out what the negotiation status is. Maybe the deal hasn't yet been concluded, still in negotiations, the intention of the investment, when it was concluded, and the company and the country that owns the company, the country that the company is from. You can go to the next slide. So then we supported 8 journalists, including myself, and journalists from Ethiopia, South Sudan, Egypt, and Kenya to report stories based on the data that they found on their particular country. So in Ethiopia, we found out that a lot of companies are growing flowers and using huge amounts of water from the Nile and exporting them abroad. But in effect, they're displacing about 3,000 people annually by the flower growing companies. And many of these horticultural investments are located close to Lake Tana in Ethiopia, which is the source of the Blue Nile. We talked to scientific sources, which told us that the growth of flowers actually takes huge amounts of water. They quoted that the production of flowers in this region requires around 20,000 Olympic swimming pools full of water each year. So in effect, through most of the stories that we covered, we found out that the companies are not just coming in to get land and export crops, but they're also taking huge amounts of water at often a very low price, with the profits, of course, being mainly exported abroad. So you can go to the next slide. In Egypt, we also found that Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which are facing diminishing water resources in their own countries, are turning to acquiring huge areas of land in Egypt to grow animal fodder and crops. For example, the Toshka project in Egypt was originally aimed to create fertile farmland out of the Western desert with the intent to boost food security and support the Egyptian economy. However, through our investigation, we found that about 50% of the project is actually owned by UAE and Saudi Arabian investors, mainly to grow alfalfa for export, not, for instance, wheat, which would be maybe a more strategic crop for food security in Egypt. And we also found that land and water were sold at much, much lower prices than the market prices. For example, some land was sold at just $3 per fadan at a time when the land price was $637 per fadan. And through calculations, we estimated that the investor purchased water that was worth $24.3 million for only $1.2 million. So it's another case of a water grab in a sense. You can go to the next slide. In Kenya, we looked at Dominion Farms Limited, which is an American company that acquired an area of swampland next to Lake Victoria to do large-scale agriculture. However, similarly to Ethiopia, 2 of the county councils had leased away the land without input of the community, which left the local people without a means of livelihood, displaced about 6,000 people. And we also found that the aerial spraying of chemicals on this swampland destroyed fragile wetland environments and polluted water that enters Lake Victoria, which is the original source of the Nile River. I can go to the next slide. In Uganda, we looked at large-scale forestry projects. There's 6 of them in Uganda right now, with deals making up almost 50,000 hectares, and they're owned by companies from the UK, Germany, Netherlands, and Norway. So all of these concessions, or most of them, are timber plantations. But at the same time, many of the companies say they're fighting climate change through reforesting degraded lands and selling carbon credits on the global carbon credit market. So part of the REDD+ climate finance requirements is that a portion of the profits goes to the local communities. So we traveled to Mayuge in eastern Uganda and reported on the case of Soga Forestry Company, which acquired a large portion of Bukaleba Forest Reserve. However, by the point that they came in, there were already 4 villages living in the reserve for many generations. And these people ended up losing their land and were actually pushed to living in a very small buffer zone between the forest and the lake. So according to the Ugandan government, they've never had any land titles, and thus they didn't have any right to the land. But in reality, they've lived on the land for generations, and due to a complex history with changing laws, changing regimes, it's a little bit unclear as to what their rights are and what they are not. Many had actually originally come to work for a government beef farm under a different regime. So we actually didn't find that the company was not attempting to support the local communities. And in fact, when you look at their records, the amount of money that they were investing in the community development had actually increased significantly over the past couple of years. But then from several visits to the communities, it was clear that just the fact that they had lost their land, which supported almost their entire livelihoods, has pushed them into a state of severe marginalization from which they really haven't been able to get out. So this story was really looking at a lot of those nuances and some of the unintended consequences of REDD plus climate finance projects, even those that claim to be supporting local communities. You can go to the next slide. In South Sudan, we looked at land deals again, and we found that a lot of the issues there stem from a lack of clear land laws and processes after South Sudan gained independence from Northern Sudan in 2011. But in fact, the government is now encouraging investments in the hope that some foreign companies coming in will actually help ease the food scarcity crisis. A lot of them had left due to the war in 2016. Foreign land deals in South Sudan that are actually empowering local communities as well. And one example was the Israeli company Green Horizon, which to try to help fix the gap in food production. And it actually produces about 1/10 of the total food production in South Sudan, according to our story. And one of the ways they're supporting the local communities is through community commercial farming projects, which empower local farmers to increase production of crops by giving them seeds, equipment, fertilizers, and technical guidance. And then the farmers are expected to give a percentage back to Green Horizon after selling the output. So this was a more positive example of a foreign land deal, although most of them we found were not supporting the local communities, but there are some examples that are. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, so at this point, I wanted to share my screen. Can you see the story? Okay, I hope you can see the story. So this was our final project. After we reported all of the stories, we put them together into this final project, which is published on New Vision and Science Africa. And as you can see, I'm not going to go through in detail, but just to show you some of the visualizations that we did, we used drone images. Then we created an interactive map of the land deals. We used videos. We did different kinds of data visualizations using Flourish. And we created these ones for each country to show the land deals. This is satellite imagery. We used it to create static graphics and also more interactive ones. It's another drone video. And then this is a juxtaposed visualization where we got satellite imagery from 2 different years and overlaid it so that you can scroll across and see how the land has changed over the years. And this is a really good tool to use when you're looking at land use changes or like the building of a dam or infrastructure or even urbanization. Yeah, so it's a very long project, but this is just to give you an example of some of the types of visualizations that we used. This is also satellite imagery, seeing the Toshka project I mentioned over the years. Okay. Yeah, okay, thank you. You can go to the next slide. So I know I'm probably running over time, so I'll try to be quick. But just some of the lessons learned, as I mentioned, we learned that most deals in the Nile Basin, most of the land deals are actually water deals. And because of this, stories about transboundary waters must have a regional significance. We can't look at just one community or one country, but how how maybe a land deal, which actually extracts a lot of water, affects not only that country, but also the transboundary, the neighboring countries. So we really emphasize collaborative and cross-border journalism in our work, and we think it's a good practice for everyone. And it was very difficult for us to conduct investigations in some countries where press freedom is restricted, such as South Sudan, and we tried to find ways to get around that and also support the journalists to be safe, but it's definitely a big challenge. We also learned of different ways to support media houses that may not have so much experience with data visualizations to publish them. And sometimes we need to give them a JPEG file as a photo that they can put in the print newspaper, or an animation that they can include in a TV story. So there's different ways that we can support them and continue. And we also learned that it really takes a lot of field reporting and sometimes multiple visits to the same place and a lot of hours of interviews to really establish trust and find out the truth in an investigation where power dynamics are very unequal, and especially where local people have been harmed by big corporations. And usually if you're a journalist not from that community, it's better to go with the local journalist who's actually from that community and understands all of the nuances that exist there. So, and also be careful of unintended consequences. You might think you're exposing, a human rights abuse, but in reality, your story may end up harming those people even more. So it's something to keep in mind. And then another thing we learned is that in many cases, especially with the RED Plus projects that we looked at, where clearly local communities have been harmed, there's not always a clear good guy and a bad guy. But actually, these are negative effects that arise from the structures and from the nature of the transnational economy, from the histories and the changing legal structures. So as journalists, we need to look at the structures that end up causing harm and also make sure to highlight the nuances. Yeah. And I have one more slide, I think. So I'm not going to talk about this story, but it's another example of the same approach that we did. More on solutions
you can tell
journalism.
us about that during the discussion, Annika. I think that would be no problem. I think actually it could be very interesting if we talk about that later.
Okay.
But thank you very much. It was pretty interesting, and especially to see the very big difference, between what you have done and the works of someone like, the work of someone like Josh. I would say Disha is some kind in the middle, because I just took some notes also according to what you just said. Your work, your project is collaborative. It's really evidently how you work in that sense. It's also cross-border. You have, this project involves 11 countries in Africa, and you have the mission to uncover stories, and that's also very interesting. Of course, that's something also Disha and Josh did, but with this cross-border, even transnational approach. And that seems a very good way to activate journalism locally. What you have done in this collaboration is, in the first place, you kind of create a ground, a basis, and that's this first gathering of data and the analysis of that data. Yet then you engage local journalists and encourage them to go and report stories and highlight conflicts that maybe will have an impact. And then, the project, everyone gets together and the project gets published, but not just published in the traditional way, but rather in the new way, using every single resource you can find. And that's really very interesting, Annika. For the next 20 minutes, well, I'd say 15, 20 minutes, we should talk a little bit about a couple of things I'd like to underscore here, and that could be interesting for our audience. First of all, I would like to talk about local and the meaning of local. Let's start with what local could create or could offer in terms of opportunities. We just saw 3 great journalistic works, but I'm asking myself, what this work really gives to communities touched by it. I mean, Josh, you came in contact with a community of loggers that is normally doesn't have much contact with journalists like yourself. Disha, you did a similar job in India, in the forests of that region, you told us. Meghalaya region, I think. Just correct me if I'm not pronouncing that well. And Annika, you did that, but just involving this 11 countries. But what has remained there after your beautiful publications, after the whole distribution that this has received? And I maybe would start by Disha. And I think it could be interesting also to our audience if we also are critical of ourselves. What will be your lesson in terms of local and opportunities for people?
So this is a discussion before with other journalists who do a lot of ground reporting. What does our reporting really bring to the local communities? I am not sure there is a lot in it for them because unless you're targeting a specific policy intervention or something very, very specific about the local community, these stories tend to be very broad, and to the individuals that we are speaking with, apart from really sharing their stories, and that's something that they are doing for us, they are doing us a favor. As journalists, I'm not sure how much it really helps that particular community itself. That's where I stand. I feel almost sometimes that I'm benefiting from their stories, but I've never really felt so much that they're gaining a lot out of this. And I'm not sure how other journalists feel about it.
Okay. That's interesting, Disha, because I think, Josh, you, if I understood it well, you had maybe the a different difficulty, and that was maybe giving these communities a very naive approach, and maybe end up defending logging at the one hand side, and at the other side ending up not understanding them. So they did receive a lot of visibility through your work. I mean, it was published in National Geographic, and we all know what kind of magazine that is. But at the end, what was the lesson for them? Do you think they would work again with a journalist as yourself?
I think they would. I mean, I really actually, there's kind of two things I think that both Disha shared, where you can really feel in many of these cases, right? It feels like the whole world's on fire in many ways, right? And what does it feel sometimes that journalism is doing? Or is it benefiting more the storyteller than those that are having the story shared about them? And to what Annika said about the very complex nuances between goodbye and and kind of the nature that I go into a lot of my stories is, what is it like to be you, and that kind of interacts with a lot of my personal philosophies and what got me into storytelling, but to always have a deeper understanding of who the other person is and their motivations and how they operate in the world and how that comes together. I also just wanted to clarify one point is that, I probably didn't make a good note of this, but when I went in the first time, it was for 48 hours. That ended up seeding the story that ended up putting me back at these camps and amongst the communities for about a month straight.
Okay.
When I was with the loggers, there was it was tough for me, right, in many ways, because when I went back the second time, it was a much younger set of guys. It was about 25. A lot of these guys that end up in these logging camps, they end up in logging camps for a reason. They're far away from home. They're kind of getting away from something in many cases, right? There's a lot of substance addiction. There's a lot of toxic masculinity. Some of your kind of framework for people in the audience. There's also a lot of loneliness and hurt and pain. They're back there for a reason, and that tends to really kind of play on some personal sympathies I have about why people do these jobs or come to these jobs. My personal belief around these loggers, a lot of what I was coming to is they were actually out in the woods to receive the healing that nature can provide, and there weren't other avenues for them to be able to support their families, right? And so like there was this great irony, as I said, the guy had the tattoo of the tree of his arms, and every time they walked into this old growth forest, it was the last time that old growth forest would exist, at least for another 10,000 years. And so I saw a real deep interaction between not only like the rugged individualism, the stoicism that kind of implies like kind of old models of masculinity in the United States, but also how extractive economics works their way through communities, kind of like re-engages this wheel cycle, this belief that I need to provide for my family. The only way to do it is to knock things down. And people are trying to get in my way from doing that. In terms of the long-term effects and the benefits to them, I don't know that my storytelling necessarily affected them in meaningful ways. I do hope, and the way that I tell the story, including today, is to garner a deeper understanding of the experience that they find themselves within to outside communities. And I also, to Disha's point, like we don't know if we're creating meaningful change, but we are creating meaningful webs of contact, right? So even though I don't know that I'm changing anything at scale, because I do think these stories, particularly in something like Tongass, although we have seen the ongoing devastation that the Trump administration has kind of wrought on public lands, if we can make them enough of a noise through a platform that can at least empower certain things, maybe it ends up on a federal circuit court's judge's desk, right? This is going back and forth. Currently, the Trump administration has just opened up the entire Tongass, which is why the Alaska story has some importance. But now 9 million of the 17 million acres have been open for logging. But I do feel that I've maintained friendships with these guys, and so they'll put stuff up, about Black Lives Matter, or I'll kind of see where their politics are, and I feel like I've developed enough trust for them where I can be like, hey, Sam, you don't mean that. He's like, oh, I'm just joking, and so, fundamentally, maybe that's not what journalism is about, but I believe in the bonds that we make between people. And if we create enough meaningful contact with them, we have a greater opportunity to have a shared understanding of each other's experiences. And that's where the anthropology comes in, and the cultural relativism.
Okay. And Annika, in your case, I think maybe part of your answer to this could be things that you already mentioned, or you mentioned in the conversation we had before. You're building this big project where many people are involved, even many sources are involved. Local people who just speak to your journalists, and you try to leave very specific things behind. For example, working in local languages, or mentoring, as you told us, or trying to transfer knowledge or tools or data so that communities themselves maybe could start working autonomously in a more or less similar way to you guys. But nonetheless, I am asking myself, when you make this very big cross-border project, what about the very small citizen of South Sudan, who just wonders, hey, a journalist came some months ago, asked me 10 questions, and then he left. What do you know about that?
Yeah, I think there's different audiences, there's different forms of storytelling, and then there's different audiences and different intents with our stories. So we try to work with local journalists and produce two versions of the story. So for instance, right now we're doing a project working with half local radio journalists and then half like national level journalists who are reporting for TV stations or for print media. And that was with the intent to reach different audiences with different, motivations. So for the local journalists, they report on the story maybe in a different light than the national level or the international level journalist does, and with a different call to action for the community. For example, we would really hope that maybe that story could spark like a debate or continuing follow-up stories within the community by people who live there, based on what they need in the community, the information that they need. And maybe in the case of the land grabs project, that could be learning about like rights that they have or laws that they weren't aware about, or even encouraging them to have some kind of community action versus like this broad, huge project that you talk about. That is more for, you know, an international audience for maybe looking at policy change or awareness, broader awareness of the issues. So I think we have to look at those two different audiences and intent. But and also it's very important, something that we've been talking about, my organization is doing follow-up stories and supporting the journalists who have already reported a story on a topic to go back to that community and see what is actually happening and has any impact come out of the story, even unintended negative impact, and really following that up. So because that's something we don't do enough as journalists, is actually going back and keep on telling the story. And then I think that solutions journalism is another bit of answer to this question, because it's solutions journalism, you can learn about what something another community is doing that's actually having an impact in a positive way. And maybe you yourself, it gives you more of an action that you can take and say, oh, maybe I can actually do this in my community, versus always looking at like negative, huge and overwhelming issues on a broad scale. Which is sometimes hard to, you know, find that action point to take. So that's what I would say.
Okay, Annika. I would like to talk with you guys. Maybe that will be the second part of this conversation, and then we'll take a look to what the public is asking. But about this, you know, very special aspect in the link between local and global, because I'll talk to you about my experience as a Colombian journalist in Colombia, the country where I'm from and where I currently work. Local stories, very local stories, have been experiencing a very new phenomenon. I mean, it's not that new if you really look carefully, but a new phenomenon in times where global stories can be published and moved globally, and that is their stories, local stories, tend to gain attention nationally and support nationally only after international outlets have covered them. And by telling this, I mean that there is something happening with local issues when national media don't respond to them. Maybe that's not the case in the US or maybe in European countries where national media are preoccupied, worried about what's happening locally. But it is in other countries, as in Colombia, I just told you, is kind of worrying, because many times local communities really depend on international or global media, global projects to have an impact on a national level. So I would like to ask you what your experience is, and it doesn't have to be, for example, in your case, Josh, Alaska. Maybe you've been in other places in the world, but what has been your experience with that? I mean, what would you say about this rather complex situation between global and local? Is, for example, this principle or this new idea or initiatives of working, as you, Annika, collaboratively and cross-borderly, an idea for, you know, overpassing this difficulty? Is that an issue in the countries you have worked? I don't know, maybe let's start again with Disha.
Yeah, so I have a few broad thoughts on this. Firstly, when you write about local communities, that's when I feel like the story hits home and readers are able to connect with it. Otherwise, let's say I'm broadly writing about the United Nations or just talking about global warming in general, it doesn't have the same resonance till I talk about how it is in a particular village in India, or how is it affecting a regular resident of Mumbai or Delhi. Only when I do that, when I join those dots, does the audience connect with it, and these issues with people. Otherwise, they appear issues that are extremely distant to their lives, even though they might not be distant to their life. So it's very important, I feel, to have that local connect in a lot of the stories that you're saying. Second, in terms of the news media patterns, we all know across the world, local journalism is dying down because of how patterns of media is changing, because a lot of things have gone digital, and then newspapers are not doing as well in many countries, although India was a market where newspapers were growing. But with the pandemic now, newspapers have taken a hard hit. And when newspapers collapse and when local newspapers collapse, you're creating a lot of news deserts. And that's one of the things that happened with my climate change series also, where I was trying to report from these news deserts so that the local issues also get some sort of national coverage that otherwise they would not get anymore, because they're not even getting local coverage anymore with the way the system is shifting. So I think so those are my two things. One is that I feel like people connect with it more. If it's a local story, they feel like, okay, this is relevant to my life, because most of the times it doesn't make sense to them how is climate change or global warming affecting me in my day-to-day life. So first, as a journalist, it's important for me to break it down to the communities. And second, it's one of the small ways we can highlight local issues that won't otherwise get noticed at all with the collapse of news media, or collapse of it as we know it right now. And we might see a new system going forward with its own pros and cons. But at the moment, there's certainly a lot of news deserts, I'd say.
Yeah, news deserts, that's a good term. It's also a great problem in Colombia. Josh, maybe would you want to add something? We can't hear you.
Keep getting that
Okay.
wrong. It's fundamentally challenging, and I appreciate that you're bringing up this question, Camilo. You know, I think what's really impressive about Disha and Annika's projects is they've managed to also like really combine like not only just somewhat international but regional storytelling, which allows people to see the frameworks that a lot of these stories are existing in and to draw larger contours that we don't get necessarily in single stories, right? Which is something that certainly I've experienced in my career after about 20 years and 60 countries worth of stories, is you really see these contours. But I think that also the power of local storytelling, even non-journalist generated storytelling, right? Because we are seeing some of the most powerful stories in the world. They're not journalist generated anymore, right? They're coming from people on their cell phones, you know, particularly when we talk about police violence in the United States or climatic issues. And there's an authenticity that I think that people are experiencing and craving in the world to understand. But it also, you know, also makes me refer to Annika's point, and I think I refer to you guys a lot because I'm, you know, as you speak, it gives me a lot of understanding of insights, is that what people, I think, you know, and maybe this is an optimistic belief, but we are kind of starting to see the systems, the larger systems at play that we're all directly affected by, right? And so that can be climate change, that can be multinational corporations, that can be the way that modern capitalism is kind of perpetrated in the world. That can be kind of cultural issues in terms of behavior and the way we relate. So we can see the strings that attach between the lack of salmon runs that are happening there and changes in rainfalls in the Sundarbans. You know, we can see water usage issues that are going on between the floral industry in Ethiopia and the Midwest of the United States. And I think that individuals are starting to, just because of the prevalence of media, that feels like it's a lot harder to break through. I imagine that's an experience that all of us have had as journalists, that it's hard to kind of get something to really stick because people's bandwidth are over. There also, I would say, is like a larger understanding of the landscape at play, you know, by your average citizen, right? I think the democratization of information flow, which is perhaps one of the benefits, of which there are many kind of downsides, obviously, to the lack of attention we can give to individual things, is helping us understand some of the same issues that all of us are facing as communities, or individuals within communities. We are not individually communities, sorry. Oh, now you're muted. Got you back. No, I'm just kidding.
Can you hear me right now? Yes? Okay. So Annika, maybe would you like to make a contribution to this big question about how overcoming this deserts of information and this lack of interest that some local topics generate in national media? I also wanted to mention that also being solutions journalism so interesting, it is also in the traditional framework and mind work of you know, editors and news editors, maybe something that still sadly doesn't really end up attracting them that much. They're looking for the conflict and for the hotspot and for the problem. And what would you say about that, Annika?
Yeah, I think you bring up really good points, and these are actually a lot of the challenges that we face too. Is that media houses are working on a revenue-based model, and a lot of their, most revenue-generating stories are not environmental stories or some that we would say, okay, this is a very important story to tell, but the media house says this is not making me any money. And in fact, we don't have money to send the journalists to the field and go out for an entire week and stay in this community and talk to the people. And this is a challenge that has gotten worse during COVID-19. It's like here in Uganda, a lot of the media houses lost the majority of their revenue, and some of the outlets were closed, salaries were cut, and of course that just makes it worse. So people don't have money to go to the field and cover these very important stories. So I think media houses really need to look at different revenue generating models, and especially looking at the democratization of media and which opportunities exist online to make money in different ways than the traditional ways, especially here in Africa. But definitely, as you mentioned, collaborative journalism can help, especially in countries where the press freedoms are restricted. And maybe, like for instance, we worked with journalists in South Sudan, and their editors had to realign the angle of the story so as not to put, the negative impacts of the land deals at the top. But then we were also able to publish the story in a couple of regional outlets, which allowed that journalist to still get out the information on different platforms. So that is a potential half answer, but I think we really need to look at the revenue models and media viability. In now the approaching post-COVID era.
Okay. Thank you, Annika. So I've received some questions of the public, but I must say that they really, they get really near to what we have been speaking about. So I'm going to skip two of them and go to a third question we received that, that maybe could be a good way of starting to approach also the end of this conversation. Someone in our audience wants to know what the next step on your stories is. And that will be your first part of the question, and second part of the question, how each of you or each of your projects are making or holding actors responsible for what they did or are doing. So I think that could be a, looking to the future and to the continuity of your project, maybe that could be a good question. Maybe let's start the other way around. Annika.
Thank you. I think I would kind of give the point that I made before, that we need to keep following up on our stories and making sure that we really lay out the facts and what are the laws, what are the rights that people have, and what is not being done, or which inequalities are there, or discrepancies, and making sure that we keep doing stories and not leaving those communities behind, so that we can follow along and see what is being done, if any actions are being taken. Yeah,
but concretely, is your project is still running, right? I mean, that's not finished, Annika. I mean.
Yeah. We're doing a bunch of projects right now, but actually we had completed the land deals project, and we were just discussing last week that we should now do follow-up stories and see what are being done in those communities. Yeah, like where the flower farms are in Ethiopia and Egypt.
Okay. Thanks. How about you, Josh? Would you rather, would you travel back to Alaska to make a kind of second part of this story, or would you rather go and discover a place so unknown and so interesting because of its complexities as that place you got to know for your story?
I mean, I would love to go back to the Tongass. You know, that place has got a weird, you know, there are certain places I feel that probably everyone experiences as a journalist. There's like these places that we end up in. Like, I never thought I would actually be going back to Tongass when I went there in 2012. And after 17 years of trying to pitch Nat Geo, this random little like 48 hours I had in Alaska ended up being my route in. You know, I've been trying to pitch them since I was 25. So there was something about the resonance of that place and going back there, which I would love to honor and continue to go back to. But I also, you know, in terms of the larger frameworks of stories, you know, I believe that after, you know, I'm almost 20 years into doing journalistic work and storytelling or cultural-based storytelling, there's themes that emerge, right? And so we become kind of sharper at seeing those themes, and not just potentially like water use, but the kind of the behaviors or the mindsets or the cultural factors that you know, kind of create these ecosystem dynamics. And those are things that I find myself interested in pursuing now. And you know, I touched on that a little bit with the loggers, but I think particularly in America, but I think more as a kind of extractive-based capitalism models or resource extractive models expand throughout the world. This culture of both kind of social isolation, which has increased through COVID, issues around masculinity and land use issues, and in terms of like removing stories from place or not understanding stories of place or legacies of place. So there are some kind of philosophical things that I'm kind of really interested in that I think that might address some of the underpinning issues that create the mirrored stories that we see across the world. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, particularly, you know, certainly, you know, whether it was working in the Kathaputli colony in northern India, it was some of the same issues at play, right? And I've actually done some work in Uganda and Ethiopia, looking at spaces and communities there. The themes are all the same, right? So how do we address like kind of the cultural models that are existing underneath? And even though as an anthropologist, I think that the culture is the same, I do think that extractive capitalism has its own culture that it brings with it, mm-hmm. that needs to be addressed if we're actually going to get at holding people accountable. I mean, what does accountability look like if we can't change the culture that gives rise to it? You know, mm-hmm. throw one guy in jail, or maybe they can get, you know, pinned in on some payment the corporation has to make to the country, but unless we can change the mindset of the people making the choices.
Thanks, Josh. Yeah. Thank you. Disha, maybe for closing up.
So the question was what next for our projects, and so for me, once I've wrapped up a project, I have now started focusing a lot more on things outside journalism as well. And by that, I mean talking more about it like I'm doing at this webinar, or I did a series of talks with think tanks in India, taking my work to a domain where then researchers can then use it and then take it forward. I try and talk a lot to policymakers, and you know, just sometimes the publications we write for, you know, we might think the story is out there and it's got a certain number of hits, but it's also important for the story to reach the right audiences, the change makers in your respective countries. And the change makers are often, it's not really defined by the number of hits that you get, but reaching the right people. So they could be the judges. I'm very satisfied when, you know, somebody will message me saying, hey, this particular Supreme Court judge told me, you know, had the chance to read your story and gave positive feedback to it. And so it gives me the feeling that, you know, when lawyers, judges, when civil society movements that are happening, they use certain stories in their campaigns to then reach out to people. I think that's your project goes forward. And I see now my role as a journalist as one of the many actors in a democracy. and along with, let's say, lawyers, policymakers, researchers, a bunch of these kinds of professions. And so, yeah, once a project is done for me, now I've begun to talk more about it, and that's a focus area. Another focus area for me personally is also to talk to other journalists. So I try my best to talk to other local journalists. I'm one of those people who will hound people saying, why don't you apply for a Pulitzer Center grant, or why don't you apply for an IWMF grant, to share some of my privilege. Because I feel like, even put together grant proposals obviously it's a reflection of certain privilege that you have, because not a lot of good journalists doing shoe leather reporting might know about these opportunities to scale up their reporting projects. So I use a lot of my work as an example to talk to other journalists saying, hey, this is how I did it. And, I'm ready to talk to you about the process. And so I intentionally spend a significant amount of my time mentoring journalists. And I try my best to mentor journalists who aren't from privileged sections. And with a focus on women, obviously, and journalists from small towns, because I feel like that's also one way to expand the reach of environment reporting by empowering local journalists to tell stories that I might not be a better person to tell those stories.
Great, Tisha. Well, thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of our time and of our webinar. So thank you very much to the three of you, Disha, Annika, and Josh, for participating, and thanks to all the people that have participated in these 4 seminars of the series organized by Fundación Gabo, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, and Grupo ISA and its program Conexión Jaguar. The videos of all 4 webinars will be available in English and in Spanish in the YouTube channel of Fundación Gabo. So I'm telling you, please to feel free to watch them. And before saying goodbye, I'd like to remind the journalists of Spanish-speaking and Portuguese-speaking countries that are here with us, watching us, that the Fundación Gabo has opened a call for postulating journalistic pieces for the Premio Gabo. Premio Gabo is maybe the most important journalistic award of the Spanish and Portuguese-speaking world. Applications can be submitted until October 5th. And the categories are text, image, coverage, and innovation. And well, thank you very much for your attention. See you next time.
Thank you so much.
En 1995, Gabriel García Márquez creó en Cartagena la Fundación para el Nuevo Periodismo Iberoamericano. Tras 25 años impulsando el periodismo independiente, ético, innovador y riguroso, ahora somos Fundación Gabo. Somos taller de periodismo. Formamos, inspiramos, incentivamos y conectamos a periodistas de toda Iberoamérica. Somos Premio Gabo. Premiamos el mejor periodismo en español y portugués. Somos Festival Gabo. Celebramos en Medellín el poder de las historias en la mayor fiesta del periodismo y la curiosidad. Somos Centro Gabo. A partir del legado de Gabo, promovemos proyectos de desarrollo social, cultural y educativo. Somos Fundación Gabo. Con camaradería y chéveridad desde el Caribe colombiano, promovemos un mejor periodismo, la creatividad y la memoria de nuestro fundador.
Al proteger al jaguar, apoyamos a que los bosques se mantengan vivos, las especies subsistan y el agua siga corriendo por el continente. Él solo existe si el ecosistema está saludable. En Conexión Jaguar, protegemos, recuperamos y conectamos los hábitats naturales del jaguar en Latinoamérica a través del apoyo a proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques. Con los proyectos apoyados, mitigamos los efectos del cambio climático al preservar los bosques, que son grandes almacenadores de carbono. Innovamos para que la conservación en manos de las comunidades sea rentable y autosostenible, al brindar apoyo técnico y económico, para que iniciativas forestales en Latinoamérica comercialicen créditos de carbono de alta calidad para financiar la conservación en el corredor del jaguar. Contribuimos a la protección y mejoramiento de los servicios que nos brinda la naturaleza, la protección de la biodiversidad, la mitigación del cambio climático. Además, apoyamos al empoderamiento y desarrollo de las comunidades rurales. Nos sumamos a las metas globales de sostenibilidad, apoyando al cumplimiento de convenios internacionales y ayudando a la reducción del impacto del cambio climático. Para cambiar el futuro del planeta, necesitamos pasar de los diagnósticos a las acciones. Haz parte de Conexión Jaguar. Apoya proyectos de conservación y restauración de bosques o compensa tu huella de carbono con nosotros para que juntos dejemos un legado a las futuras generaciones. Si hay conexión, hay vida.
The Pulitzer Center is a nonprofit journalism and education organization that funds reporting that otherwise wouldn't get covered. We take the work in those projects, use it in our educational engagements to extend the life of the reporting and promote as much conversation as we can.
It is vital to tell underreported stories because we live in a world that's much bigger than us.